that Dante really agreed to and endorsed, the imperial Rome, the supranational state that could organize and thereby contain competing national interests. But the other one really has a new project, a really modern project of how culture shaped by Roman values could become the culture for the Renaissance.
I remember in your book on Petrarch that there is a splendid passage there about Petrarch being the first real tourist, in the sense that he goes to Rome and sees Rome as a place of ruins and of a past which is really other, in a way that perhaps it was not so for Dante, who maybe believed that there was more continuity between his era and Rome.
That is true. I probably though would have to. I can't remember the paragraph. You have excuse me, an amazing recall of these things. But I'm sure that some other paragraph in my book, I do mention that, for instance, take the famous speech Petrarch gives from the Capitol Hill, from the same place when they grant him the famous laurel crown. He's so aware that the laurel crown in Rome had stopped being distributed ever since the time of Domitian, who gave it to, I think it was Statius, but he goes on making a speech that literally recalls Cicero's own speeches from the Capitol. So the continuity, the spiritual continuity between Petrarch and Roman antiquity, the culture of Roman antiquity, is probably more pronounced than it is in the case of Dante. Dante really saw a continuity in the facts, in the reality of history. The empire was then, and now it's an empire now that ought to be legitimated and viewed in its autonomy now. This was the whole argument of monarchy. Petrarch really is trying to find the points of contact between the culture of the antiquity and his own culture. Both of them, though, disagree with Augustine's assessment of Rome, if you see what I'm saying. So there is and this does not mean, as some people could, I'm sure, jump and say, oh well, they're really less theological. They are both deeply theological, and the theology doesn't mean one thing, and certainly does not mean only the Augustinian take on it.
In the Renaissance, the humanism of the Italian Renaissance was completely steeped in...
Isn't that tautological?
Yes, it is, to a certain extent. But tautology can help clarify some things sometimes. The ancients were the foundation for certainly the civic humanists. Leonardo Bruni, Coluccio Salutati, and Roberto Rossi, and all these people who were such great champions of, above all, the Roman Republic, if not the Roman Empire, unlike Dante. But it's something that continues, as you mentioned in your opening salvo, all the way through, certainly in the early modern period. Giuseppe, but we decided before coming on air that we would like to talk a little bit about the tradition of the Italian epic, in particular Ariosto and Tasso.
That was my understanding, yeah.
Yes, but I can't resist, before we turn to the epic, to ask you just briefly about the lyric tradition, because I mentioned this course I taught recently, and I was again astonished at how incredibly, inexhaustibly rich is the entire tradition, and how many people who we don't necessarily think of primarily as poets wrote sonnets, as part of their activity.
But you were mentioning that I agree with your judgment, your taste. You were mentioning the Tasso as a lyrical poet. He's extraordinary. I think he is probably, the one who queried him was of course Leopardi, and without the lyrical poetry of Tasso, there would be no Leopardi. And
I think also Pascoli, with his phono symbolism and this kind of, it's amazing to read Pascoli about 3 weeks after we read Tasso, because we were going at a very fast clip, and Tasso is clearly the forerunner.
I agree. He's extraordinary. In fact, I think that that would be an appeal to some of your friends, the great poets, to turn to because he really needs a good translator. There are people who are translating him into prose, and that's not enough. That's because if you read him thematically, he seems to be, the variations are always in the few details here and there, but not thematically. He tends to be. He would even deceive you into thinking that he's a Petrarchan poet, and he isn't.
Right. So turning to the epic, Giuseppe, we have a very long and rich tradition in the Italian, Pulci and Boiardo, but we don't have time to discuss them. We really want to talk about two of the main epic writers after Dante, which would be Ariosto, author of the Orlando Furioso,
Absolutely.
And Tasso, the Gerusalemme Liberata.
And I don't know which of the two deserves the crown. I really don't, after so many years. You know the story. Can I interrupt you?
Yes.
I know that you want to ask some very specific questions for your readers are so intellectual, but this is a little aside. The famous battle, in the Renaissance, throughout the Renaissance, which was the greater poet? Was it Tasso? Was it Ariosto? And two guys come to blows first, and then the duel to decide, by the power of the duel, the ordeal, which of the two poets is better. One wounds mortally the other, and is about to die, and he just, with the last sigh, says, "Gee, but I never read either of them." So the arguments it adds something about the specificity of the Italian spirit, the comical element of the Italian intellectual tradition, all the time present.
All the time. Much more in Ariosto than Tasso, I would say.
Yes.
And if we're talking about crowns, so I did a show recently on the Symposium with Andrea Nightingale, and in that dialogue, Alcibiades crashes the party, and he comes to crown Agathon, but when he notices that Socrates is sitting next to Agathon, he says, "I can't crown one and not the other," so he divides the crown and crowns them both. So I would do the same. And
that's very good. Very good.
So you mentioned the comic element, so let's talk first about Ariosto. I believe Pirandello has this beautiful and pretty well-known essay called Humorism.
Yes.
And for Pirandello, Ariosto is almost like the paragon of a humoristic literature, which is, on the one hand, it's comic, but at the same time, there's a deadly seriousness in the comedy.
Yeah. I would agree.
For our listeners who haven't read the Orlando Furioso or might not know a lot about Ariosto, what kind of epic is the Orlando Furioso, which translated means Roland gone mad.
Gone mad, gone crazy because of love. Well, it's first of all, it's a poem. Of course, you are recalling the genealogy of this all the epic tradition. You mentioned Pulci and Boiardo. I really think that the poet of foundations, in every sense, in Italian, the foundation of the epic itself is Boiardo. Who they are all picking up one element which comes from the grand impact of Western history, the trauma of Western history, the Song of Roland, and the defeat of Christianity because of the hubris of Roland, so that the Muslim-Christian confrontation keeps obsessing them, and they all return to it, but so does Pulci, who is an extraordinary poet, and maybe if we are not here debating, you and I, of which of the two, Tasso or Ariosto, is the better poet, I would say maybe we should consider giving the crown to Pulci, extraordinary poet who writes a divine comedy in every sense of the comical that I think Pirandello is talking about. Boiardo is the one who reinvents the genre, in the sense that he starts by saying, look, Turpin has given the whole story about Roland, what a great warrior he is, but he omitted something out of fear that the reputation of Roland could be somehow diminished, the story of his madness in love, mad for love. That's really what I want to tell, the story. And everybody that follows starts writing, in effect, romance epics, in the belief that the story, the love story, the story of romance, the story of the absorption of the mind and the deliriousness of the mind in itself, it really is the matrix. of the epic, meaning the historical involvement of the hero. And Ariosto picks that up, but picks it up exactly from Boiardo. So it's an epic romance, I would call it, just to answer your question directly. The grand theorists around Ferrara, they all write in Ferrara. Ferrara, why Ferrara? That would be another long paragraph I should open, and I won't. Anyway, Ferrara is a city, a splendid city, but caught within trying to get out of the grip of its provincialism and trying to emulate somehow the city of Florence. But the history of Ferrara is short-lived, and these poets work in that court and leave.
So we have in Boiardo a rewriting of the traditional Christian epic of the Song of Roland, and he introduces the romance element into it.
Yes.
And it's almost like a little digression or a parenthesis about Roland falling in love. And this poem, the Boiardo's poem, which is called the Orlando Innamorato, Roland in Love, it ends, it's actually not finished, it ends abruptly because of the invasion of Italy by the French forces, and Boiardo says, as long as the real armies are coming into my country and invading, I feel like I can't go on writing this poem. Which
Can I say that in Italian?
Yes,
stanza,
please.
the last stanza, famous last stanza. Mentre ch'io canto, o Dio Redentore, vedo l'Italia tutta in fiamma e loco. Per questi galli che con gran valore vengono per disertar non so che loco, però vi lascio in questo vano amore de fior di spina ardente a poco, un'altra fiata, se mi fie concesso, raccontarovvi il tutto per espresso. And I should really explain this so that your readers, who I'm sure know Italian, very well, regardless of what your preliminary remarks were about. What has happened is that Charles VIII of France, in 1494, invades Italy. Boiardo hears the news and he stops the narrative. The scene that precedes this is the scene of this lesbian love between Fior di Spina and Bradamante. But and he's aware, Boiardo is aware that look, Charles VIII has invaded Italy. I start my story with France and Turpin and almost comes full circle, as if the myth of France is still hovering over the whole of Italy. But what is he also saying is that history's realities are now entering the world that I have here conjured up, and he says, I hope this is an interruption, but maybe it's not an interruption. He prays to God, a kind of Deus ex machina, but he knows that this intervention, divine intervention, this time won't work, and so it's the tragedy, the historical tragedy of Italy, the lack of virtue in the land, the sacrilege of the invasion. This is a great irony of that line. The invaders, the French invaders, they think they have valor, and they will make a desert out of this land, and they're going to call it peace, of course. And then it just says, I'm going to leave you with the vain loves of Fior di Spina, which means the flower of thistles, but we are going to be left with thistles.
Thorns, yes.
Thorns. We're going to leave a crater. The explosion is such, we're going to be leaving a crater of thistles. And that's the end of
and I love that word, disertar.
Deserto.
That they're going to create a desert, almost as if they're going to go into the very space of the imaginative literature, which in these epics is the forest.
Absolutely.
And create out of the forest, a desert and render this kind of imaginative literature impossible.
Let me just say that that's great, especially when it comes to Ariosto. But of course, the world of Tasso, it's the world that takes place. The action takes place in the desert in front of Jerusalem, and in that sense, it really picks up the desert of Dante in Exit to Israel, the Egypt, and so on. So the desert, it really is the space of epiphanies, the space of loss, the space of wandering, etc. For the two major religious poets of the Italian intellectual tradition. But with no doubt, with Ariosto, you're absolutely.
So if Boiardo is in some sense it's the father poem of the Orlando Furioso of Ariosto, and if Ariosto he's like a son on a mission to redeem the unfinished business of his own poetic father.
He is.
And he continues this poem, and he adds another twist to it that it's not just Roland in love, it's Roland who has gone completely insane out of love.
Between the two, Boiardo was in family connections, connected with family connections with Pico and the whole Neoplatonic movement. Ariosto has a chance, so there's a lot of